Hello, everybody. I'm Alex, and welcome to the B-side where we strive to go beyond the hits and inform you of the music that you might be missing out on. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about English pop star, singer, songwriter sensation Ed Sheeran. Now, just a little bit of a personal background as far as what I knew about Ed Sheeran going in. I'd heard all of his studio albums before, and I'd heard parts of his EPs, but he has like so many of them from over the years that it's kind of hard to keep track of all of them. So I've only heard a small fraction of what he's done. So it was very interesting for me to kind of go in depth and listen to his older stuff and figure out from whence this pop star, this megastar came from, to figure out his roots. And I would say overall that while I definitely don't think his music is comprised of like works of genius, I've generally enjoyed it as a guilty pleasure in a way, but also not as much of a guilty pleasure because I know these songs are, generally speaking, pretty well crafted. So I don't know, it goes either way, but I would say in general I've liked his stuff. But enough about me, let's get to the artist. Edward Christopher Sheeran, born February the 17th, 1991. He was born into a relatively musical family. He sung in his church's choir when he was a kid, and he learned guitar in high school, I believe, and as a result, he started working on music from a pretty early age, and this shows up when you look at his official releases because at the age of just 13, I believe it was, Ed Sheeran dropped his first official EP. The EP is called The Orange Room. It was released in March of 2005, so that would actually make him 14. But most of it was recorded when Ed was about 12 or 13. It was taken from a period of about a year and a half, 2 years of recordings. And stylistically, it's a bit of a mix between indie rock and more acoustic songs. Very lo-fi, which is unsurprising given the era in which it was made. And in theory, I suppose it is impressive that someone of as tender of an age as Ed was able to write and record songs like these. Unfortunately, this doesn't make the EP a particularly listenable experience, if only for the fact that Ed Sheeran's a 13-year-old boy, and you know what happens to teenage boys? They hit puberty, and with puberty, their voice starts cracking. The song Addicted in particular is a really painful example of this. There are some awful, really out-of-tune falsetto breaks that Sheeran tries to go into. They don't sound natural at all. They sound almost painful. And really, that kind of just sets the stage for everything else. I would say Addicted is the worst example of this, but Sheeran's voice does not sound mature at all on this EP, and it really hurts the listening experience, like, severely. But I suppose I can't rag on this EP too much. You know, again, it's a 13-year-old, 14-year-old kid writing songs. I'll give this one a pass. About a year later, on March the 22nd, 2006, Ed Sheeran releases his Selftitled EP. And I put EP in quotation marks here because it's 38 minutes long. So, for all intents and purposes, this should be a full-length album, and this should be considered Ed Sheeran's proper debut album. But, you know, it's listed on Wikipedia as an EP, I suppose, so I guess we're going to talk about it as if it's an EP. Thankfully, the vocals have improved noticeably, they've matured nicely, and the entire record, aesthetically, I think, is an improvement over the original. There's not as much of this focus on lo-fi indie pop, which was never a direction I felt that Sheeran was going to fit well in. Instead, this record has a bit more of a coffee shop vibe to it. The song Way Home is a nice early demonstration of Sheeran's ability with vocal harmonies, and the track Pause is interesting only because it is Ed's first foray into hip-hop, albeit a fairly shit one. The guest rapper on here is Ed's cousin Jethro Sheeran, posing under the name Alone Star, and all he does is kind of just spit this shit verse in the middle and not really anything else. And then the production of this entire track just seems half-hearted and pretty flimsy. So, not a good first step for Ed Sheeran, but I suppose it is a step. I don't think there's enough interesting material on the self-titled album to warrant it being 38 minutes long, but it's still a step forward in the Ed Sheeran artistic progression, as is the follow-up EP, or again, really an album because it's the same length, Want Some, released on June the 29th, 2007. Apart from the production having a bit more clarity, this EP is essentially a repeat of the self-titled Ed Sheeran 2.0, one might say. I do find it funny, however, that Alone Star guests once again on this EP. He appears on the track Move On. And Alone Star has a very interesting habit of name dropping himself whenever he can. And I know that's a pretty typical thing with rappers and hip hop artists, but Alone Star does it to the point where it's almost comical. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's a highlight or a low light for the album for me, but it is what it is. Now, after this EP, we have a dead period of about 2 years or so for Ed Sheeran, and this kind of marks a transitional period in his life as Sheeran kind of decides whether or not he wants to take music and pursue it as a full-time career. Obviously, he does, and the way he does it is very strategic, I find. In the interest of getting signed by a record label, what Sheeran does is he prepares, records, and releases in sequence a series of 5 EPs, each with their own kind of identifier, their own trademark, their own niche. And he does this over a period of about 1.5 to 2 years. And as you can see, it works extremely well. And what we're going to do is we're going to go step by step and explore each of these EPs individually. The first of these EPs is You Need Me, which was released on November the 2nd, 2009. And this EP is entirely acoustic, which is definitely a transitional change from the more coffee shop stylings of Ed's previous releases. I'm pretty sure Ed kind of advertised this album as being his indie EP, and I don't know if I would describe it as that because it kind of sounds like a collection of demos more than anything else. But either way, I think it's effective and certainly shows his strength at writing for just acoustic instruments. Definitely the highlight of this EP is the title track, You Need Me, I Don't Need You, which is probably the first truly strong song in his catalog, and it's a really excellent example of his lyrical flow, not necessarily his rapping ability, but his way to kind of spit out lyrics and write lyrics that naturally flow off the tip of the tongue very nicely. This song is very, very important for that reason because obviously Sheeran has kind of made his bread and butter out of songs like that, as well as the more romantic songs, which we'll get to in further releases. The second EP in this series is arguably the most famous of the 5, Loose Change, released on February the 7th, 2010. There's a somewhat fuller production to this EP, more usage of electronic percussion and things like that, and I don't think it always works. The track Sofa is extremely overproduced for being a song that's pretty soft-natured generally, but it also does foreshadow a direction that Sheeran is going to work more towards as the years go on. But if there's one thing I can give this EP credit for, it's the debut of the song that really put Ed Sheeran on the map, and that is The A-Team. The A-Team, I think, works really well because it has very sincere subject matter. It kind of discusses the struggles of a cocaine addict that Sheeran met, I think, about a year or so previously. And that sincerity makes it not only one of his strongest songs from a lyrical perspective, but also just kind of one of his strongest songs in general. The melody is also really appealing, and the structure and flow from verse to chorus and interlude, etc., it just works really nicely. So you can tell how this track became a hit, even though it wouldn't really reach mainstream ears until about a year after its initial release. I don't have a ton to say about the third and fourth EPs in this sequence. The third is Songs I Wrote with Amy, which was released on April the 4th, 2010. And this EP kind of serves as the really soft singer-songwriter collection, while also kind of being an example of what Sheeran can do when working in tandem with someone else, in this case, working with someone named Amy Wadge, who has co-written songs with Sheeran for years before that, and since then, I believe she co-wrote Thinking Out Loud with him, among others. And it's nice to see Ed working in that dynamic, but none of these songs really stuck out to me. They had a very samey feel to them, for lack of a better description, I suppose. So this is not one of his more essential releases. And neither was Live at the Bedford, which was also released in 2010. It's kind of just a collection of Ed's studio songs, but performed live at the Bedford without significant changes. So it is what it is. Worth a listen if you're a diehard, not really worth your time if you're not. But it's the fifth EP that I think is really worth investigating and unpacking a little bit more, because while it might not be Ed's most famous, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, it is probably his most interesting of these five, and I'm talking about number 5, Collaborations Project, released on January the 7th, 2011. This is an EP of collaborations with various different English hip-hop artists and rappers, and as a result, this makes the EP the most hip-hop oriented project SHEERAN's ever released. And the reason why I say this is a good thing, even though I don't speak highly of Ed Sheeran as a rapper, is because SHEERAN's not the one doing the rapping on this album. Generally, what he does is he writes and he sings the hooks for these tracks, and he lets the rapper in question do his emceeing, do his bit, and Ed doesn't get in the way of that, which is a really good idea on his part. I wish he'd do that more. Like I said, this might not be the most famous of the EPs, but I would argue it's the strongest because of how quirky and unique it is in comparison to the rest of the SHEERAN catalog. But I also don't necessarily say that because of the collaborators either. These are all pretty obscure hip-hop artists. A lot of these rappers hail from the genre called grime, which is an English hip-hop genre that has not aged particularly well over the years, and as a result, more often than not, these verses feel pretty damn corny. But its eccentricity plays in its favor, and as you can tell, it worked for Ed Sheeran, because this EP was what really caused labels to give him attention. And indeed, this EP reached number 2 on the iTunes charts, and by this time Atlantic Records had already taken an interest in Sheeran. Now they decide to flat out sign him, and as a result, work starts on what will eventually become Ed's major label debut album. And of course, I'm talking about Plus, released on September the 9th, 2011. The majority of songs that Ed recorded for this album are brand new. There are a few exceptions, such as the A-Team and the City, that were reworked, rearranged, and then also the track You Need Me, I Don't Need You, which I think benefits the most from this rearrangement. There's a very heavy emphasis on electronic percussion and vocal percussion in this new arrangement, and this combination really complements the spitfire vocal delivery that Sheeran brings extremely well. Funnily enough, You Need Me is actually kind of an exception, though, as far as how Plus treats these electronic elements. I mean, there are apparent hip-hop influences there, but they're very subdued, generally speaking, and they're primarily apparent in these very subtle drum samples that appear in a number of the tracks. So they're not part of the foreground. They're not a focus, really. As far as the new songs go, I feel like Ed's songwriting is sharper and clearer than it has been on previous releases, and I really feel like he has a good sense of flow when it comes to his songs. The tracks feel very complete this time around. They never feel rushed or overly long, usually, which I think is a significant upgrade on some of the tracks from his EPs. I think the best example of this kind of evolution as far as individual songs go has to be on the closing track, Give Me Love. It evolves over a lengthy period of time and grows in intensity, particularly in the vocals, as Sheeran goes from kind of crooning to belting in the choruses to then just absolutely screaming in the outro, and we have these vocal harmonies, these dense vocal harmonies backing him up, and it really just builds up into this cacophonous finale. But then just when you think the album's all over, Sheeran decides to include an a cappella cover of the traditional folk song The Parting Glass as a hidden track of sorts, which I like a lot. I like the English folk tribute here that he's doing, and it closes the album, I think, in a very sweet way. Well, needless to say, this album blew up. The A-Team became very popular, as did other singles like You Need Me and Lego House. But before we really get to talking about Ed Sheeran as a pop star, there is one more EP that we do need to touch on. I'm talking about The Slumdon Bridge, which was released on February the 14th of 2012. This EP is a collaboration with a rapper named Yelawolf, who is an Eminem protege who at the time had just recently been signed to Eminem's record label, Shady Records, and had just dropped his debut album, Radioactive, the previous November. And I don't know, I mean, being called an Eminem protege is a good thing generally, but apart from his flow, which is pretty decent, I really can't stand this guy's tone. I mean, you listen to the song You Don't Know, for fuck's sake. It's very aggravating, I find. Once again, SHEERAN's role in this EP is mostly to provide the hooks for Yellow Wolf's verses, and like Number 5 Collaborations project, this is a good idea. In fact, I would say that the melody and production in the chorus of the track Faces, for example, is better than almost anything, if not everything, on Collaborations project. Otherwise, though, I can't really say that this is one of SHEERAN's more enjoyable EPs, but that's, again, less on Ed and more on his choice of MC here. So, not great. During the 3-year waiting period between Plus and Ed's second album, SHEERAN wrote approximately 120 songs, I think the number is, and he ends up narrowing that down to about 15 for the final album, and the resulting product is released on June 20th, 2014, and of course, it's called Multiply. This album is a very logical step forward for Ed, both as an artist and as a producer. Rick Rubin had a large influence on the production of this album. I believe he was a consultant with Ed throughout much of it. And it shows because the production of this album has a very nice sheen to it, certainly nicer than most of Ed's previous releases. One thing that Rubin seems to have done on this album is increase Ed's usage of drums and synths and things like that, as opposed to the more acoustic feel that stuff like Plus had. Some songs do retain a slightly similar vibe to Plus. The track Bloodstream lopes along with an acoustic melody that's coupled with some subtle electronic drums, so it's a track that would feel very much in place on that album. But then we have other tracks that careen in just wildly different directions. I mean, take the lead single, Sing, which is produced by Pharrell Williams of all people, and just reeks of happiness and ebullience. It's just wildly different than anything else SHEERAN has done. Even his explorations into hip-hop and, territory closer to R&B, nothing has ever approached this before or since. It's the closest Ed has come to really writing a proper pop song out and out, and it's fun. It's definitely not a highlight for me personally, but I see the appeal, and I can't deny the chorus is catchy as hell. Generally speaking, I would have to say that this is probably SHEERAN's strongest album, because there's a collection of tracks that just have really great hooks on them, but at the same time, there are songs that just feel like missteps. I do want to point out the track The Man in particular, because that song makes the fatal mistake of doing what projects like Number 5 Collaborations project managed to avoid. Instead of having Ed sing the hooks of these hip-hop oriented tracks and allowing other people to rap the verses, Ed handles both now. And again, the thing is, Ed Sheeran is not a rapper. He can say words relatively fast, but that doesn't mean he has charisma. That doesn't mean he says things well. He's not absolutely god-awful, but you get the feeling that he's kind of stumbling around a little bit, and most importantly, he sounds so fucking white whenever he raps. It's kind of annoying. But yeah, apart from the rapping, there's, again, some strong tunes, and this album was so popular when it was released that chances are you know half the songs on this album at least. The breakup diss track almost, Don't. You have the very nostalgic Photograph. You have the soulful Thinking Out Loud. The track Tenerife Sea is one of my favorites. I think very underrated in the Ed Sheeran catalog. But there are just so many hits from this album, and however, obviously, there's more to come with the next release. Obviously, because of the success of these tracks, Sheeran absolutely blew up everywhere and became one of the biggest names in pop music very quickly. And this continued for a while until the end of 2015, when he suddenly announced he was taking a year-long break from social media in order to focus on making his third album and to just de-stress, I suppose. True to his word, he comes back a year later, announces that the album is nearly finished, and on March 3rd, 2017, we finally get Ed's third studio album in the form of Divide. From a sales standpoint, it's kind of an understatement to say that Divide was worth the wait because this album dominated the charts in a way that very few albums ever have, if any. I'm kind of specifically talking about the UK charts here, but for example, there was one week where 9 out of the top 10 songs in the UK charts were songs from Divide, and all 16 tracks on here, including the deluxe edition tracks, all 16 charted inside the top 20 because of how astronomically high Ed Sheeran's streaming figures were. It's kind of just an insane amount of achievement for this one release, so it kind of seems ironic at the same time that this is probably Ed's weakest proper studio album, if not by that much. I've never found Ed Sheeran to be a profound lyricist. I mean, you have exceptions like The A-Team or A Fire Love, which is dedicated to his grandfather. I think both of those are very nice from a lyrical standpoint. But this album feels particularly shallow and one-dimensional. Most of these songs kind of focus on Ed as this hopeless romantic figure. He just loves everybody. He loves being with people, but he can also be lonely, but he can be satisfied. It's very confusing. And then there's also the occasional message of how he's an underdog, just a guy with a guitar who never got a college degree, but now he's big and anyone can do anything if they set their mind to it, and all that bullshit. Sometimes he's able to move past this simplicity by kind of resting on his melodic laurels, I guess, his skills with melody. The song Perfect, I think, is an excellent example of this. Very saccharine sentiments, but the chorus on that track is excellent as far as I'm concerned. But for every track like that, you're going to have a track or two like New Man, which is next level cringe inducing as far as some of the lyrics on that song go. And then you have the songs like Galway Girl or Nancy Mulligan or Barcelona that borrow from like traditional like folk cultures. And they're so simplistic that you almost feel as though Ed is appropriating the culture, even when in the case of songs like Nancy Mulligan, that's a culture he kind of is a part of. It's very strange. The track Dive has some very passionate vocals from Ed, among the most passionate of his career, but there's a couple of problems with it. Number one, it's a ripoff of Thinking Out Loud and doesn't really try to hide it. And number two, there's a guitar solo in the middle from Eric Clapton, of all people, that sounds like it was recorded via a telephone. It sounds very tinny and just kind of clashes with the general production on that song, which is very sad. It's also a very short guitar solo, like 4 measures maybe. But even though I've said a few negative things about this album, obviously, there are a couple of reasons why I don't hate this album as much as most critics might seem to. The closing number, Supermarket Flowers, is a very genuinely touching tribute to Sheeran's grandmother, and I think in many ways the most sincere song on the album from a lyrical standpoint. And also, I've got to say, the production on this album is top-notch. I mean, this record sounds genuinely great. I mean, the opening track, Eraser, sounds just so lusciously crisp that I can even forgive Ed for, trying to play the role of rapper again. Again, it's not good, but the production saves that song entirely for me. And really, it saves much of this album from being pretty dire. But yeah, while I would consider Divide to be Ed's weakest release, generally speaking, I would also say that his 3 studio albums are generally in a pretty similar tier as far as quality-wise. Personally, I think they're all just pretty decent. I wouldn't say any of them are great albums, but I can understand if you love Ed Sheeran. I totally get it. I can see the appeal. Just not necessarily my favorite artist. But yeah, guys, that about does it for my commentary on Ed Sheeran's discography. I think his is an artistic progression that has been very interesting to witness as he's gone from independent singer-songwriter to full-blown pop megastar. And I'm very interested to see where he goes from here, what new avenues he decides to explore, if any. Did you agree or disagree with my takes? Either is fine. We're all friends here. Don't miss the next video where I talk about Justin Vernon and Bon Iver, analyzing his entire discography and every project he's been involved with. So not just Bon Iver, we're talking Volcano Choir, Big Red Machine, the whole kit and caboodle. That's all coming up next time. But yeah, guys, until then, Have a good one. Later.